Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA grades against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names, and sometimes compare players from different positions. For example, lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, just because of their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do a comparison not between just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and have similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 6 different metrics to compare each player. The first category is scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game both regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency and advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage per and win shares per 48, both in the regular season and playoffs. The reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Field goal percentage tends to be biased to big men because of their height and play style closer to the basket. I also put in win shares per 48 here because it encompasses efficiency along with other attributes to give you an idea of how many wins a player contributes to his team. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks and steals in this comparison is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have steals and blocks tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by All-Star appearances, All-NBA selections, MVPs, Finals MVPs, and championships as the first, second, or third best player. The reason I have to only count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0, and it's not representative of how much better a player is if they weren't a top 3 player on their team contributing to a championship. I know including All-Star selections is a little bit controversial because it's fan voted, but ultimately this is what the Hall of Fame uses in their criteria to induct a player, as unfair as it sounds. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them as equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. The only one that's different about the ABA is that instead of Finals MVP, they have Playoffs MVP, which honestly is a better idea than Finals MVP since it accounts for the whole playoffs, but just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the ABA Playoffs MVP as Finals MVP here. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are counted, because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 80s, which is unfair to older players. Also, I'm not using any career total stats because that's a longevity thing. For example, no one would say that Karl Malone was a better scorer than Michael Jordan, even though he has more total points. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I have not watched most of these players live, or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. No time travel or what if this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. I'll be strictly basing their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. The 11th episode in the series looks at 2 power forwards who played their prime in the 2000s, and while they weren't the best at their position in the league, were still solid players and potential Hall of Famers. Bosh is best known as one of the greatest Toronto Raptors players who later teamed up with LeBron to form the Miami Heat Big Three, and operated as a solid third star on the team. Amare Stoudemire was known as a stellar pick-and-roll partner of Steve Nash for the great Phoenix Suns teams during the 2000s, who were one of the best teams to never make the NBA Finals. Which player had the greater career? Let's find out. In this category, both players were very close but scored in different ways. Bosh had more range than Amare, could play on the perimeter as well as the interior, while Amare's scoring came mostly from the post and interior. Bosh averaged 19.2 points per game for his career, peaking at 24 points per game in 2010, and 15.6 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at 24 points per game in 2008. Amare averaged 18.9 points per game for his career, peaking at 26 points per game in 2010, and 18.7 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at almost 30 points per game in 2005. Amare had the higher peak here, while Bosh was slightly more consistent, echoing a theme we've seen throughout these comparison videos. This is close, but I'm giving Amare the edge here since he has a similar average to Bosh in the regular season, but his playoffs average and peaks outweigh Bosh's by a bigger margin. The rebounding category is fairly close too, as both were solid rebounders for their position. Bosh averaged 8.5 rebounds a game for his career, peaking at 10.8 a game in 2010, and 7.5 rebounds per game in the playoffs, peaking at 9 per game in 2007 and 2008. While Amare averaged 7.8 rebounds a game for his career, peaking at 9.6 a game in 2007, and 7.4 rebounds a game in the playoffs, peaking at a more hefty 12.1 boards a game in 2007. Again, this is a category that's so close, but as Bosh had the slightly higher average in regular season peaks, I'm giving this category to him by a slight margin here. In the passing category, neither player were great passers as they were not expected to be their team's main playmaker, but Bosh averaged 2 assists per game for his career and 1.3 assists per game in the playoffs, while Amare averaged only 1.2 assists per game for his career and less than 1 assist per game in the playoffs, giving the slight edge to Chris Bosh here. In the efficiency and advanced metrics category, it's very close as both players have fantastic true shooting percentages and are very close in all three categories. Bosh was the better shooter, but Amare played closer to the basket, giving him an efficiency advantage here. However, since Amare is ahead in all three categories by a slight margin, I'm going to have to give this category to Stoudemire. In the defense category, neither player are superb defenders, and their defensive win shares are fairly close, with Bosh coming out ahead by a small margin, but also he played more games than Amare did, so I have to ultimately put this category as a tie. In the awards category, Bosh has more All-Star appearances and of course 2 championships on his resume, but only 1 All-NBA selection, which is to the second team. Amare doesn't have any championships and has less All-Star appearances, but has 5 All-NBA selections, which is 4 more than Bosh had. You might think that championships are ultimately what matters, but Bosh was the 3rd best player for his rings, meaning it matters just a little bit less in his case. Whereas the fact that Amare was chosen to the All-NBA team so many times over Bosh does mean something as well. So Bosh has the rings and Amare has the All-NBA selections. In the end, I'll have to call this one a tie. So when all the categories are summed up, Chris Bosh wins the rebounding and passing categories by a small margin, while Amare Stoudemire wins the efficiency and scoring categories by a small margin, with the rest being a tie. Again, if I had to choose a tiebreaker here, I would say Bosh's slight advantage in defensive win shares will put him over the top here. Chris Bosh was definitely one of the best power forwards of his era, who has become relatively underappreciated as the 3rd wheel of the Heat Big Three, while Amare is even more underappreciated as he never won a championship and had an injury-shortened career, but was viewed as one of the best power forwards of his era multiple times as well, and would often give great power forwards like Kevin Garnett and Tim Duncan headaches in the playoffs. Hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and as always, stay tuned for the next comparison video.